Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeff Koshin West. I am founder of Integral Transformative Bodywork. We shorten that to ITB. Today we are doing ITB Sunday School, and our topic for today, and actually for this month of July, we are focusing on shadow and what shadow means, what shadow work is, different perceptions of that stuff, and why it's important for the personal transformation process and for the personal transformation experience and for recovery and different topics along those lines. So today, actually I should say last week, we focused on, the video was specifically about the origins of shadow and what shadow means and how it's formed and stuff like that. So we're going to do a quick recap of that, and today's focus is actually doing shadow work, and then something called the specific type of shadow work we like to do here at ITB is 3210 process, which was created by Ken Wilber in the Integral Life community. And then we're also going to talk about another way of kind of relating to shadow, which was created by Hal and Sidra Stone of the Voice Dialogue community, which I'm a huge, huge fan of. And this is going to be, we're going to be working with different voices and how they talk about shadow and how they create an opportunity to clean up shadow and work with shadow material. So that's our focus for today. So as we go forwards, we are going to first start out with a kind of a recap from last week, just so we know we're all on the same page, because we got some new folks showing up today, and it's always good to, you know, recap some of the stuff that when you're doing continuous process. So first up, we're going to start with the term shadow. The term shadow comes from traditionally the Western psychology type of perspective. The major names contributing to this conversation of shadow are Freud and Carl Jung. And they had, although they were the ones that used this term very much so, and were kind of the ones that are kind of considered the caretakers of this term, or the creator of this term, they did also have some different perspectives on what shadow is. We're not going to get too wrapped up in their different perspectives, but that's kind of where that term came from. The term shadow has kind of evolved over the years, but in general, the term shadow has to do with any component of our human experience or human identity that has been disowned by us. Okay, so this means that to kind of clarify what disowned means, is that you might have noticed that when certain painful experiences happen in your life, you most likely don't like those. You most likely don't look upon them fondly and want to put them behind you. In fact, in a lot of our Western culture, specific here in the US, we have these ideas that we should just move on from these things, that we should put the past in the past and just leave it there and everything's cool. And a lot of us, when we've had really intense emotional experiences or tragedies occur in our life, we very much have this interest towards moving on and not having to think about it. It's a burden to have to think about it. It's painful to think about it. It's agitating to think about it. It can cause all kinds of different emotions and sensory experiences. And so this is kind of what we're talking about. That's one way of disowning, of like pushing it out type of a deal. It's similar to denial. All right, so if you're familiar with that concept of denying something is real for yourself, it's very similar to that. And when we deny something that's happened to us or an emotional experience, or if we deny a component of ourselves, we're kind of disowning it, kind of pushing it out of our human experience, or pushing it back behind us so we don't have to pay attention to it, kind of like an out of sight, out of mind type of a thing. Shadow is problematic because if you disown stuff, it doesn't go anywhere. Shadow, nothing of your human experience ever disappears. Okay, it's always from a neurological and a biological, neurological or physiological perspective. Every experience you've ever had is actually burned into your nervous system. It's actually physically there. They're called neural pathways. So you can't really get rid of something that you've been through. You can't truly get rid of it. It may be something that falls out of prioritization of the mind, if we're going to speak from a psychological perspective or talk about the psyche. It may be something that kind of moves into different directions or kind of falls away from a main priority of self-identification. But anything that's ever happened to us as human beings never actually leaves. It's always a part of us. From the stress response experience, meaning things like if you've ever experienced a fight or flight or ever heard of fight or flight experiences with folks, this is a period of time when we're very, very scared or very, very angry in the face of a danger or a threat, whether it's a high level of threat where we're thinking we're going to die, or it's a low to medium amount of threat where we just simply think our safety is deeply compromised. So also the reason why we don't forget this stuff, the reason why the mind doesn't just get rid of it and not use it, and the body just doesn't get rid of it, is because anything that's the prioritization of the mind is, excuse me, the prioritization of the mind and of the stress response system and the fight or flight system is to make sure that if there was a threat, we better remember it and calculate it. So if we identify information similar to that threat in the future, we don't die from it, especially if it was a severe type of an experience or an intense type of an experience. So these are kind of reasons why we don't want to think about shadow as something that we can get rid of. And so when we deny it, or when we kind of disown a trauma or something intense from us of our life, we're kind of contradicting the natural order of the physiology and of the nervous system, and we're fighting. We're kind of in an internal battle with ourselves. And we'll discuss what to do the opposite of that, how to integrate shadow. This is actually what this whole July is about, is what you ought to be doing with shadow material. So we'll talk about that as we go forwards. Another thing that usually happens with shadow is it's not just, shadow is not a place, we don't just disown things that are overwhelming or intense or life-threatening, like a trauma or something scary or dangerous. We also disown parts of ourselves that we, as young people, as young human beings, we don't identify as part of our value and part of our worth. And this is oftentimes passed down to us from our guardians, whoever the caretakers were of us, as well as the smaller and larger culture that exists around us. And so an example of that is if we just think of something like emotionality. Okay, your ability to be emotion as a human being. Human beings, no matter what their sex or gender or what's going on for them, every human being has an experience of emotional experience. Now, some folks are on this line of intelligence of emotion. Some folks are very advanced, some folks are not so advanced. Either way, every human being feels. Okay, every human being has emotions. The reason we have emotions is to give us deeper data and deeper understanding of what's happening interiorly and exteriorly and with other people. Humans are hugely social. So emotions are a key to creating healthy relationships and healthy bonds in order for us to actually survive. Because one human in the world, or one human in the wild, I should say, fending for itself, has a much lower probability of survival than 2 or 3 or 4 human beings in the wild trying to survive. So emotions are extremely important to us. They also are freaking awesome when it comes to just having relationships beyond just this conversation of survival. They're also they create a very wonderful richness of life interiorly and exteriorly. So emotions are extremely important. So if I come from a family, especially here in the States and here in the West, where emotions may be seen as weaknesses, or emotions may be seen as problematic, as messy, or not as worthy as facts or rationality, if I come up in a family that suggests emotions are weakness, let's say, emotions, my emotionality, I may start to disconnect from. I may start to kind of poo-poo and disregard my emotional experience, my emotional content, because the ones that love me and the ones that are caring for me and the ones that are helping to define the nature of reality for me, they are telling me that emotions are shitty, emotions aren't useful, emotions are signs of weakness, so I shouldn't have them. And so since I want to be loved, since I want to be safe, since I want to belong to these human beings that are caretaking for me and protecting me, I will push that material out of me. All right, even if emotions are super duper helpful and I can glean a ton of information from emotions, and even if emotions are a primary source of creativity and enjoyment of my life, I will push them out because the overriding guideline for most children is I want to be held, I want to be touched, I want to be loved, I want to be nurtured, I want to belong, because of a whole laundry list of reasons why I want that. So when we look at the human experience of shadow, what can be disowned can be pretty much anything within the human experience. Now, we touched on this last week a little bit with the integral map. I'm not going to get into the integral map right now. We will get into the integral map next month and the following months about what integral theory is. But integral theory and the integral map is basically, under my assessment and many other people's assessment, it is the most thorough map of the human experience of consciousness. So it talks about a huge spectrum of scientifically valid, reproducible, confirmable evidence of what it is to be human, what it looks like, what our experience of, what every human's experience of reality entails. So we use that in ITB to kind of help us understand, what am I disowning of my natural quality? So there's several components of, there's 5 major components of the integral map. And each one of those components is a rich domain of exploration in the human world. And any component of the integral map can and oftentimes will be disowned by a certain individual. And so when we start talking about shadow, one of the fun things to do is to have a good map of what I start with. So if I know that every human being starts with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 unalienable components of their humanity, then I can say, okay, cool. How am I doing on this one? How am I doing on this one? How am I doing on this one? What am I disowning of this material? And then I can start to get to work on what I've disowned, not because of a major trauma, but because I wanted to be included. I wanted to be loved. I wanted to be nurtured and supported by those important human beings. So these are the 2 primary. There's other ways this shadow can surface. You can have a varieties of different things going on, but every one of us human beings has traumas from some age, and every human being has has disowned something of the integral map, something of our humanity. So it's kind of 2 domains that we have to pay attention to, and 2 things that we have to kind of, if we are going to say I want to be a whole human being, or if we're going to say something as audacious as like I want to transform and I want to evolve as a human being, I want to be my whole self, we do have to have a good map first and foremost. So that good map kind of tells us a good story about what we could possibly be disowning. So that's important stuff. So the term shadow is basically having to do with anything that is disowned as far as I'm disowning a certain trauma or I'm disowning a certain aspect of my humanity. One thing about trauma I'm going to say also is that trauma looks different based off of the human being's age. So a teenage human may not identify, might not call something traumatic that a 5-year-old may call traumatic. So a 5-year-old can have a toy or an element that they play with that's very dear to them, and that toy then gets broken or it gets thrown away or something along those lines against the child's will or against the child's interests. And this actually may register as a trauma for the child. This may be a major hit for that child's psyche. It's a major loss for them to a certain extent. But for a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old or an elder human being, because of stage development, we don't register those things similarly. We don't see the loss of a toy as the same thing. So that means that earlier traumas that occur for a human being, we want to just kind of honor them as equal. We oftentimes want to just receive them as, okay, this is a trauma. Okay, I'm willing to receive this as trauma. Now you can work them beyond that and start to create some gradation of like, okay, it's not as bad as something else, but we always want to receive any, like if as we're doing this work and we receive kind of this inner child experience and we kind of make contact with a younger self that is just heartbroken over the loss of a toy, or heartbroken over a haircut, or heartbroken over not being able to have a friend over this one period of time, or being told this, or being tricked by mom and dad or by their guardians in some form or fashion, and it really hit them hard. No matter what the younger self inside you identifies as trauma, honor it as trauma, because it's not you at your current age perceiving that trauma, it's you at a younger age perceiving that trauma and taking that hit. And that shit is real, okay? Do not pretend that just because it happened to a younger form of yourself, it's not real and it doesn't carry gravity, because we have found that it very much does. Even if you as a 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old human being and beyond, even if you're looking back at this child and being like, holy shit, it's not that big of a deal. You just broke a toy. It's not that big. That's fine from the adult perspective, but we want to honor the gravity of what the child's going through inside of us, because that's real and that has impacted our perspective of reality. So that being said, we can kind of go ahead and move forwards into this stuff. So that's kind of the origin of shadow and where shadow comes from and the term shadow. So that's kind of our catch up from last week. So we can now kind of jump into how do we do shadow work, how in ITB, what we call shadow work. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to give you some suggestions about how to do this stuff, how to do shadow work, and what to do before, what to do after, how to prep for these things, and how to go through the motions. Okay, so we're just gonna hop into that for a second. Our concept of shadow work is it's two primary components. It's the voice work that I touched on a little bit earlier, and it's that 3-2-1-0 process work. Those are both come from psychological perspectives, but they are not primarily psychological tools. So you don't have to be a psychotherapist to use them. You don't have to be a psychotherapist or a counselor to share them with other people. Voice dialoguing is a practice that you can get training in, and there is no official certification in it. You can get training in it, but it's not the official domain of just psychotherapists or psychoanalysts. You can be a clergy person, you can be a coach, you can be a teacher, you can be a parent, and you can offer this information up, as we oftentimes do. That's one of the primary things we're interested in doing in ITB. So I have significant training in voice dialogue work. I also have significant training in the 3-2-1-0 process, shadow work. The 3-2-1 shadow process comes from Ken Wilber in the integral community. The voice dialoguing comes from Hal and Sidgerstone, the voice dialoguing community. And it's basically what we also see this as. It's not technically what we would consider true psychotherapy. In fact, Hal and Sidgerstone didn't identify voice work as psychotherapeutic in nature, as a psychotherapeutic tool. They identify it as a self-education tool. It was their primary interest was sharing an education tool on being human. And so that's kind of what kind of shadow work I'm going to be doing. Now, technically for us in ITB, any activity you perform that engages, informs, unveils, and integrates disowned material, anything you do to that fits that category is technically shadow work. Okay, so you can reach that through art, you can reach it through music, you can reach it through meditation. There's all kinds of different domains you can access disowned material and reintegrate it. And that's really fun, actually. That's something that we get really excited about in ITB, and that's where we bring our shadow work to some other different domains. But if we're going to talk about just the shadow work that we like to do, the stripped down, raw type of shadow work that we do in ITB, it's going to be the 3-2-1 and the voice dialogue processes. So some suggestions before, kind of to get started in doing this work, and some ideas to do afterwards. So first and foremost, make sure you're rested, make sure you get some food, and make sure you're exercising during this process, okay? What that means is basically care for yourself when you're gonna be doing shadow work on a regular basis. If you do take up shadow work as a practice, you really wanna make sure you're fed, you're watered, you're rested, and you're exercised. This allows for more stuff to come to the surface and more general steadiness of the identity. All right, if you want to see your shadow flare up, don't do some of those things. So avoid rest, avoid eating and hydration, avoid exercise, and you'll see usually your agitations and your shadow materials start to surface. This is a little bit dangerous though, especially if you have a history of addiction or substance abuse. One of the things they talk about in substance abuse is one of the best ways to ensure that you don't relapse or increase the probability that you don't relapse is to always make sure when you feel like using that drug or taking that alcohol is always to be sure to ask yourself these basic questions. Have I eaten and drinking in the past 5 hours? Have I gotten enough rest? And have I done some exercise? Because when we see the absence of these things, we see the tendency for the identity to move back into habitual addictive practices. We see that just jump through the roof. So a lot of shadow work has behavior that's attached to the material, okay? And so when that's the case, we then have a habit of behavior that's usually attached to the emotional material, or the, not emotional material, to the material, to the shadow material that's been disowned. And so since there's the shadow material and then the behavior that goes with it, that's usually behavior that's a habitual kind of addictive behavior. We also want to take this this note from the AA community and substance abuse community that say, make sure you do self-care before, when you start to feel some of your habituations trying to take over and kind of work you a little bit. So food for thought as far as that's concerned. Make time and space for these practices. That means that we suggest you carve out at least 30 minutes to start out with. Give yourself a good half hour. Put your phone away, set a timer, make sure there's low stimuli in your environment, make sure you're relatively safe. There's not a lot of people moving in and out of your area very much. And make a space for it, make a time for it. We also suggest you very much keep a logbook when you do this stuff. There's a lot of stuff to keep up with this type of practice. And so having a logbook can be very helpful. So we call them shadow journals in ITB. So having a shadow journal can be really, really, really darn helpful. We also offer, if you were to do some work with us at ITB, we offer worksheets on this stuff. So it's one of those deals where we do suggest you write this stuff down, because there's a lot mentally to take care of. It's a lot internally to take care of. There's just a lot of data to take up, okay? So make time for, do some self-care, make sure your basic needs are met. Make sure you make some time and space for doing the work, all right? Set those boundaries. Make sure you then have a logbook or a shadow journal, which is gonna be super helpful for keeping up with that data. Also something to keep in mind as we do this work, if you're feeling discomfort, if you're feeling agitation or frustration or anxiety or numbness, this means you're doing it right. All right, so usually the defenses that come up in relationship to kind of unveiling shadow, or as we walk closer to disowned material in us, we usually get signs of anxiety, agitation, frustration, anger, sadness, and fear. We get other physical, psychosomatic experiences start to surface up, maybe a tightening in the throat, some headache, maybe some sweating, maybe tightness or nausea in the tummy or in the diaphragm. So if you start to notice these things, this is perfectly normal, typical stuff, not a big deal. The reason this material shows up, the reason this discomfort shows up is very, very basic. The reason why this shows up is because when you disowned this material, there is most likely a discomfort associated with this material. Like from a trauma, obviously the trauma didn't feel good. So the trauma and the story around the trauma probably doesn't feel all that good. And so when you start walking towards it, you kind of have to go through that not feeling good story, that uncomfortable sensation, uncomfortable emotions, maybe uncomfortable thoughts. So as you do this work, that may be something you will bump into. When it just comes to something you've disowned as a part of yourself, you might have kind of been bullied into disowning a portion of yourself. You might have been, if you were told that, you know, to use our example from earlier, if you came up in an environment where emotions were identified as weak, you might have then said, oh, well, I'm not going to be weak, I want to be strong. And there might have been a derogatory frame of mind and intention pushed at emotionality, and that helps push emotion out, push that component out of your awareness, disown it even more. So oftentimes the reason why discomfort surfaces when we're doing shadow work is because most of the time, whether it's something we've disowned or a shadow, there's uncomfortable material around it. Okay, especially when it comes to uncomfortable material, when it comes to disowning a portion of yourself. I mean, the mindset oftentimes of the child is, if I don't get rid of this part of myself, I'm not going to be loved. So of course there's discomfort, because then the reverse of that is, if I feel this and bring this home, somebody might not love me. I might not be lovable. So we got to remember that the awareness and the mind that disowned whatever the material is, whether it be trauma or a part of ourselves, we got to remember that However, we most likely disowned it with uncomfortable sensations, or uncomfortable sensations came with the disowning of it. So we then have to understand that it's totally par for the course for, as you start moving towards shadow and welcoming home this material, for you to feel uncomfortable and for things to be not so pleasant. So we always say in ITB, if you're feeling uncomfortable, if you feel an anxiety, if you feel shitty when you're doing shadow work, good job, you're doing it right. So that's one of the ways we kind of relate to that stuff. Because of this, and because of what goes on with shadow work and the fact that you are uncovering things that have been disowned and uncomfortable material and traumas and different things like that, that may be very overwhelming and very scary for us. Excuse me. Because that's the case, we highly, highly, highly suggest you have a team. Okay, we suggest you build a team for your recovery and for your integration and for your dismantling. Because as we go forwards, when we do shadow work, the reality is that we are challenging the pillars of your identity. We're challenging the pillars of the infrastructure of how you see reality, how you see yourself, and how you perceive the universe, all of creation. And that means that there's going to be parts of you that are going to think this is really, batshit crazy to go for the infrastructure. Should we change the infrastructure? Why would we want to do that? Isn't that going to make us unsafe? Isn't that going to be dangerous? And the reality is that this is how the body oftentimes sees doing shadow work and will protect itself and will want to create security. So we have to be careful and we have to be mindful about going forwards with this shadow work, and having a team is best. Having a group of folks that you can trust, meaning coaches, clergy persons, if you have them, or if you're part of those communities, as well as other counselors. When you do shadow work, whatever material you uncover during shadow work, you ought to be bringing it to them. That's what us ITB stewards are for. That's one of our primary motivations, is to educate folks as they go through that process, and to just be around to hold the bucket for them if they have to kind of spew and share and kind of talk about this. Myself and the other ITB stewards, part of their education is specifically in navigating just a shit ton of shadow work. The ITB steward is kind of berated by me, their instructor, to constantly be doing shadow work, and we do that work together and process that work together. So what you get on the other end of their education process is a human being who has, and to put it in my terminology, who has gone through hell and back over and over and over and over again. They've done the work over a 5-year period of facing very intimately their fabrications, their misgivings, their inequities, how they visited traumas on other people and how traumas have been visited upon them, how they've disowned portions of themselves and flat out lied about who they are. So it's one of those deals where every human being has this in their system, and what we see in ITB and ITB stewards is this is what they do, this is how they get their initiation, this is how they get their education. So when you work with a steward, you're working with someone who's kind of been through hell several hundred times, doesn't live there, but knows how to go through it and knows how to go through the process. So this is why the ITB stewards are very, very, very kind of unique in the world. All right, so our 2 practices, 3-2-1-0 process and voice work. So we're going to start with the 3-2-1-0 process. So the 3-2-1-0 process is, the 3-2-1-0 has to do with perspectives. Okay, so third person perspective, second person perspective, and first person perspective. So a quick overview from probably our like elementary school or high school experience of literature. A third person perspective is in a story or in a movie, you see everything that's going on. You don't have any interaction with directly. You're not like a character in the storyline. You're watching all the different characters in the movie go through the process, and you see probably 97% of the storyline unfolding. So if you're in a third person perspective in relationship to a movie or a book, you kind of see the majority of what's going on in the storyline, okay? And you're not a character in it, okay? Second person perspective, if you're in a movie, is you are actually taking the perspective of a character in the movie. You're kind of living you may not be the main character in the movie, but you're a character seeing, kind of seeing what's happening in the storyline. You're not privy to all the information. You don't see what all the other characters do when they're off screen. Or see very little of what they do when they're off screen. And in the second person perspective, you're in relationship to the story, and you're a character in the story of usually a second level of importance. So you're not the primary character, you're a character seeing things going on. So it's kind of like a middle point. You are in the story, you see some material, but you don't see all the material and storyline. First person perspective, this is really helpful in a lot of gamer communities and our movies as well. Happens a lot more in video games though. A first person perspective is where you are the one going through the movie. You're the main character in the movie or in the game or in the book. So no matter what the storyline is, you're the one moving through the process. Okay. So you're seeing only certain data that you can possibly see. You're only hearing certain conversations, and you're missing a lot about what the other characters are doing. You have to kind of figure that out along the way from that first person experience. We'll talk about the zero in a second, because the zero is more of like a Zen philosophy thing more than an actual similar thing to the first, second, third person perspective. So we do this work because this is the reverse of how shadow is disowned. So a first person experience of shadow it's not shadow, it's just me. It's like, it's a part of myself that I'm going to disown. So every shadow everything that's ever been disowned is actually something that's deeply personal to me, that I've pushed out, I've given away, I've disowned for whatever reason. So first person perspective is with this material is I feel it in my body, I have physical experiences of it, I have emotional experiences of it, I have memories, and I have thoughts, and I have visions about the experience that we're talking about. If it's uncomfortable or overwhelming or something that I hate about myself, I'm going to disown it. So I'm going to push it outwards. Okay. So in this situation, second person perspective, when shadow makes it out there, I will most likely do what's called projecting. So you'll see other people in your area, and let's say we go back to our original example of emotionality and the uselessness of how emotions are weak. When that shadow gets pushed out into a second person perspective, out into the second person perspective field, you may start to ridicule people who seem emotional. You may stay you may move into an identity that's very cold and rational in relationship to emotions. And you may actually create relationships where you're the cool, calm, rational one, but all your other friends are all emotional. Okay. Or you may maintain a relatively cool, calm relationship to your emotions. They're there, but they're not important to you. You mostly focus on, rational or other components of your identity. But when you see other people being weakly emotional, you maybe get nauseous. Or you may be like, holy shit, they're so weak, I can't stand them, I hate when they do that stuff. In other cases, you may actually get afraid of them. You actually may be scared of them in your environment. And so this is usually how we do that second person perspective shadow stuff, is I'll project it on the people in my immediate environment, and I'll feel usually in a not so pleasant way in relationship to them. Okay. When shadow gets pushed out even farther, we start to see it into that shadow space it's something that's far away from us. It's that experience of shadow in the third person. It starts using language of the third person we language, or the third person them language, the third person they language, third person it language. So we will start to see the world at large and larger systems as problematic because they are emotional and weak, and that makes them weak or bad, or the world is emotionless and dry and void of any kind of juicy emotional content, and not having any kind of interesting stuff. The universe is just a machine. The universe is just this basically clicking equation that goes on, and there's no life in it. There's nothing important about it. It's just this very distant type of experience in relationship to this greater, larger system that we are in. And we are oftentimes, our experience of it is very distant. We've oftentimes at this point in time, when shadow is that far out from our personal experience, we're usually numb to it. We don't think, we're very clearly understanding that from second person to third person perspective, we're very much not the problem. Okay. From first person perspective, it's a problem because it's in my body and I'm feeling it. And so that's a problem. So I'm going to push it out. But when it comes to the second person perspective or second person relationship to a third person relationship, it usually gets to the point where it's like it becomes less and less about me. It's their issue. In a second person perspective, I'm having a problem with it because they're emotional, not because I have a problem with my emotions. It's because they're being emotional. In a third person, it's more along the lines of, there's avoidant. There's nothing to it. You know, there's a, it's all it language, it's all they language. I'm usually very, the experience of it in most people's body is it's very numb, and they're very numb to that fact, and they're very kind of removed and distant from that fact. So that's the usual process of how shadow gets pushed out. And so with the 3-2-1-0 process, Ken Wilber suggested that we reverse that process. And so what we would do is, taking this example of emotionality, we would say something like, all right, so imagine a personification of an emotionally weak person, okay? A person that you are fairly certain is very emotional, so it makes them weak. Okay, so imagine a person that would look that way. Imagine a person that represents that thing. And you would kind of imagine them in that experience, imagine them as that component. And you would imagine that, you would create a personification of it. You would imagine it, you'd use your imagination to put them in the room around you somewhere. And then you would go through the process of naming what they're like. You would kind of take off the strainer of political correctness or of being gentle languaged or not being judgmental, and you'd want to get into judging them, assessing them, and talking about, what do you see when you look at that thing, when you look at that personification? What do you see? What is their body language like? What type of body do they have? What are they wearing, if they're wearing anything? What do they, and you want to bring the rest of the senses into it other than just the eyes, and you want to add ears. What does it sound like when they talk? Do they have a certain tone around them, of sound around them? So is there a heavy sounding tone? What do they smell like? What does this person smell like or sound like or look like? You also want to bring your empathy into it. You want to get a sense of, as you empathize with this person, what are they like? What are their values? And you just want to kind of scribble this stuff down and write this stuff down systematically, so you can start to get an idea of how you tell the story of this personification, okay? You're not going to interact with it just yet. You're just going to be watching it and observing it. So as you do that, take your time with that. We usually give, a certain amount of period of time with that stuff. It doesn't oftentimes take too long. And you kind of want to really stick with the imagination, and you also want to bring the rest of your sensory tools into the process. So you want ears, eyes, nose, mouth, even taste. If you want to taste them, that sounds weird, but bringing your taste into the experience, at least tasting the air around them. Other bodily sensations, you can reach out and touch them and see if they're frail, or see what their body feels like, see what the textures of clothes they're wearing, if they are wearing any clothes. Get a feel of their physical body. Also, a physical sensation is also, as you empathize with them, what do you feel like as you look at them? Do you feel disgust? Do you feel afraid? Do you feel angry? Do you feel numb? What are the emotions that come up? And then also the tone of the experience as you empathize with them. So that would be the third person perspective exercise. So then we move to the second person perspective exercise. The second person perspective exercise is more complex, no doubt about it, but also can be a whole lot more fun, because what we're going to do is we're going to take that same personification and we're going to have them in the room, but we're going to pretend to have a conversation with them. So this is where we bring our imagination up to a higher level here. If you struggle with visualization, if you struggle with interacting with visualizations, what I would suggest is find an object that represents this personification. If you can make a drawing of it, or if you can find an object in your room, or if you just want to scribble on a flat sheet of paper a weak person because they're an emotional person that's weak, and just put that out, so those will be words and symbols that will remind you of who you're talking to. Have some type of symbol of them, of that personification. And then I literally suggest setting up 2 chairs where you guys are face to face or relatively close to face, and you're sitting in one chair and you put that symbol in the other chair, and you talk to that symbol. You ask it basic questions of, what's it like to be you? What do you want? What is your motivation? What are you interested in? And if it's to use our personification of a person who's highly emotional and we think they're weak, we could start with, why are you so emotional? What's the big deal with emotions? Why do you focus on emotions so much? And we start asking them questions about the nature of their existence. An important thing to keep in mind as you're doing this work: you are not answering for them, okay? So this is also why it's helpful to do the chair thing, because we really want to separate and create a healthy boundary between you who's asking the question and the person or the personification that's supposed to be answering. So what we want to do is we want to maybe start with a list of questions that you may want to ask, and then ask one by one and wait for the personification to answer. Now, this may sound, I know this may sound very, very strange. Wilbur used to say he used to describe it as divine schizophrenia. But it's definitely one of those things where this is you just kind of talking to a projection, you talking to a personification, a representation of that which you are uncomfortable with or you're not happy with. And that's a great way to kind of begin this process. And it maybe sounds weird, but it's extremely helpful to kind of start with. It's really extremely helpful to get to work with. People who do this, people who do the 3-2-1 process, 3-2-1-0 process exercise, they oftentimes find that this is where they glean the most amount of information. Third person perspective tells them a story of what they're observing, but it's when we start having a dialogue where a lot of secrets, a lot of hidden information starts to come to the surface. Because if I ask a question of this personification, just kind of wait for the personification to answer, I'll usually get information about myself that actually I didn't understand, I didn't know. So this can be a really, really fruitful process in becoming self-aware and understanding other components of yourself that are alive and interested, okay, and functioning in your world and in your reality. So this is the second person perspective. A little bit of comment on this. We are working off of the idea that you can identify the personification of this emotional person that we perceive weak. Some of you may be wondering, well, how the heck, this is, Jeff, you've given us this one idea in this example, but how do we first and foremost find shadow? How do we do that? How do we start looking for it? And the best way to start looking for it is, it's a very, very, very simple piece of advice. In the past week, who has identified a person, whether that person is fictional, in a movie or a character in a movie, whether that person is real, a friend of yours, a coworker, a politician, someone that is real in reality to you, that's either inspired you or irritated the shit out of you. So think of people and or characters in your life right now that this week have either inspired you or irritated the shit out of you. Both of those perspectives of inspiration and irritation, both of those will usually, if you bring them to the 3-2-1-0 process, you'll start to see results occurring. You'll start to understand and uncover why you have issues with that, or what material is kind of lost in them, okay? But once again, if you're talking about a person who's irritated the shit out of you, and you're in the second person perspective in the area of doing of the process of the second person perspective, remember, you're not answering for them. So if this is like, all right, so one of my clients, one of my clients I've been recently working with has a is irritated as hell at his mother. Okay, it's a son and a mother situation. They had recently, asked him for some help. The situation, he was interested in helping. The situation went sideways, and now he's got a lot of shit that's coming up. So we're having some conversation, and in this situation, when we're doing shadow work, I don't want him to answer if we have him doing the work, and the personification of the shadow material he's working on is his mother. We don't want him. I don't want him to answer for his mom. I want him to ask the question and then wait for the personification of his mom to respond. So once again, it's that same story. Do not answer for the personification. Wait to hear what the personification has to say. And believe me, they'll say something. All right. If they seem quiet, if they seem like they're not communicating, wait for some type of psychic transmission, like you're empathizing with them and getting an insight to what's going on for them, or watch their body language, watch how they relate to you. These can be ways that personifications or portions of shadow material may have a need to express themselves through physical movement, through physical expression, and through the empathizing between the two of you. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen, so we want to be aware of it. So that's our second person perspective. You want to create your questions. How are you? What are you needing? What is your motivation? And we want to do reflective listening while we talk to these guys. So if they say, what's your motivation? And the personification comes back, well, my motivation is to be full of life. And we say, all right, well, why does emotions mean being full of life? And then the voice may respond, because when I feel emotions, I feel connected to life. I feel a part of life. And then we can come back with the question of, well, if that's so important to you, does it mean that not having emotions means you're lifeless? And so we're playing the game of, in reflective listening, you're taking the information of what the person is saying, and you're then kind of reading into it and asking them if you're hearing them correctly. Okay. And this process of of reflective listening just kind of deepens the understanding between you and the personification that you're working with. This is gold. This is such beautiful, beautiful work. And the more you ask these questions and do reflective listening with each one of the questions, the richer the exchange is going to be, and the more you're going to uncover usually really, really, really wonderful bits of information that elucidate why you maybe have hangups in the world. Okay. Next up, we have the first person perspective. So first person perspective can be, personally, this one is the most scary for me. I know it's also very scary for other people. And it's oftentimes a point of scariness or apprehension or anxiety, mostly because of what you're asking them to do. You're going from the second person perspective where there's the personification over there and I'm sitting here. And then what you want to do is you want to get up and move into the personification's position. So you guys kind of fuse back together. You come together again, and that experience is in your body. That projection, that personification is now in here. You're feeling it as yourself. So like I said, shadow work goes from in my body, pushed out into the world, into the second person perspective reality, into relationships, and then gets pushed into the we space, which is even farther out. So I get numb to it. So that's how shadow is disowned. So we're going to bring it back home. So we go from the third person perspective, second person perspective, back into our first person perspective, into our body. So I'm going to get up out of my chair. I'm going to go and sit in the other chair and start to feel and sense what it's like to be that disowned material. In this case, an emotional person who I have identified as weak, or has been identified as weak by people that I trust. So as I sit with that emotional person now back into my body, a person that feels emotions is now in here, in my system. What does that physically feel like? Meaning, what do I physically feel in my body? When I have emotionality, quote unquote, an emotional person in my body, and as I am an emotional person, do I feel any physical tightness anywhere? Do I physically feel sensations in my body that are pleasant or unpleasant? It doesn't matter. Just taking in data about what kind of sensations do I have in my body. Because even though it might have been in the storyline, I might have identified from third person or second person perspective that I didn't really like this shadow very much. As it comes home, it may actually feel good. For the person who's disowned their emotional self, for emotions to finally come home, they may feel really raw, really juicy, really lit up. And they may feel, even though it's maybe a little bit achy, it may feel real good to them, like they're actually alive. So such is the truth with a lot of shadow. When it starts to come home and we start to embody it, it may feel odd, but there's also what oftentimes we report after we move through the discomfort or oddness of it, there's a sweetness that comes with it. There's an appreciation that is oftentimes felt in the body. So as that comes back into your body, as you're allowing yourself to identify as the whatever shadow material is, as you're identifying as it and allowing it to live in your body and in your heart, you want to kind of receive it and ask those questions. What are the physical sensations? What sort of emotions do I feel about this? As this emotional person, what do I think about? What do I value? What's important to me? And what's my intention? What's my momentum as this emotional person? And getting a feel for that and letting that in and having that experience. One of the other questions that we touch on in the second person perspective, and that relates to this first person perspective experience, is we ask the question in second person perspective, we ask the question of the personification, how would you like to show up in this life? What would you like to do together? How can we include you more in this life? And when you get an answer from the personification tells you, I'd like to be included in your life in XYZ ways. When you get that information, apply that information. So I was working with this one person who was identified as having a dissociative disorder, having losses of time and having broken times of experience and having pretty intense trauma because, and the dissociative disorder was associated with some pretty intense trauma from her childhood. And so this person, as we were doing this work, what we noticed along the way was, as we were doing some of this work, she had, and what evolved in our sessions was she had a personification of a younger self that began as pretty emaciated and distant. And then along the way, when it finally started talking to us, the personification answered the question by, I want to go have ice cream. I want to take me to get ice cream. I would love to just have ice cream and hang out. And so when we wait for the answers from these personifications, we hear really powerful messages from them. And like I said earlier, a trauma may come at a younger age. So the way that a personification, the way that they need, the way that they want, the way that they feel maybe integration and connection may not be from an adult perspective at the age in which you're doing this work. And this is an example that I just gave. This example reminds us that you don't have to do oftentimes, over the moon type of stuff with these disowned selves and with these selves that are coming home to heal. You can oftentimes just listen to what they want, and their requests are actually really easy to meet most of the time. All right. And if you can't do them in the physical world out there, so to speak, you can definitely do them here in the interior world. So oftentimes, especially since a lot of trauma and a lot of disowning happens as a young person, a lot of the requests from those young injured or disowned selves are oftentimes kind of childlike in nature. They want to play, they want to adventure, they want to do this, they want to have physical nurturing that you would give a child. They want these types of requests are very common. So when it comes back to that first person perspective experience, my client, they went out and they did something very, very brave, which was they went and got ice cream, and they started with ice cream as like, I'm going to get this ice cream. I'm going to let, my inner self kind of order which ice cream we're going to get. And then we're going to sit down and we're going to have this ice cream. I'm going to imagine them having the ice cream over there. And then what my client did was a really courageous thing, which was they were in a private enough territory where they brought that inner child, young girl, inside of them and started to feel that inner self, that younger inner self inside of them, tasting the ice cream and eating the ice cream and just enjoying having a body, enjoying experiencing the experience, not being under threat, just being in the world, being a human being, having an ice cream as this younger self and older self in unification and bringing it into the heart and loving it that way. And so with the 3-2-1 process, that's kind of how we go to that experience. That's how we go through those phases. Now, the 0 part is not really a perspective oriented thing. The 0 part really does go into a lot of wisdom traditions and a lot of meditation traditions. The 0 represents a witness consciousness meditation, where you move into, to use some Zen language and to use our ITB language, the Zen language is to move into your pure awareness, to move into your clear, deep heart mind. And this is an awareness of a unification of the mind and the heart, unified in the heart. And this is an identification from heart space that is not bound by time. It's unbreakable. It's something that it makes room for everything. It's essentially the canvas in which the human experience arises. So instead of identifying, to use this analogy of a painting, our true nature, I should say, which we call pure awareness or vast potentiality, our true nature is the canvas, and what goes on the canvas is the eruption of existence that we have as human bodies. So this human body that I occupy, this situation I call Jeff, that's not truly my true nature. That's just something that's kind of arising on the canvas. That is my awareness that's watching and participating and alive in every moment. So our true nature is the canvas. So when we talk about 3-2-1-0 process, the 0 part is identify as the canvas and witness what you've just kind of gone through. Witness the history, the stories, the uncomfortable sensations, how those uncomfortable sensations might have led to wisdom, allowing room for all of the experience. And as canvas, allowing the whole of the story to just be loved, to just be embraced. Not loved as in, oh man, that was really cool and I need to make this a positive experience, but loved as in recognizing its inherent worth and its inherent value and your inherent value as an identity and as a personality. And that even though this story happened to you of tragedy or of disowning stuff, it still makes you worthy of love. And it fundamentally makes you acceptable and value to your own awareness. So no matter what that shadow material is, when we move into that 0 space, I'm simply raw, awake, heart, compassion, witnessing, love, receiving that story. And we want to make it heart-based. We don't want to make it head-based. We want to make it heart-based. Science tells us the more we engage our history through our heart, the higher the probability, for whatever reason. I don't think there's been a clear answer on this, but the probability increases that our stress levels start to normalize. And that's usually measured by heart rate and brain activity. But the story goes so far when we look at this material is that the more we reside in heart space, the higher the probability, for whatever reason, the higher probability that our stress nervous system, our stress response and nervous system integrates the experience and starts to not be overwhelmed by thinking about the experience. So it's true integration, as we talk about it in ITB, it's integration and emergence. Okay, so as we start to do this zeroing process, when we go 3-2-1-0, take all that 3-2-1 material and bring it into the 0 space, into the canvas space, and we identify as the canvas in relationship to this 3-2-1 material, it's a really beautiful opportunity because we just kind of hold it and receive it and create this kind of divine okayness about it. It's not good. It's not, we're not polishing shit, meaning we're not covering it with a new coat of positivity. We're really just being raw and honest and clear with the fact that that was something that happened to me. This is something that has occurred. This is shadow material that has occurred. That's a part of my humanity. And it's not good or bad. It's just the nature of what is. It's just the nature of things that are unfolding. It's the nature of my life. And I'm so much bigger than just a shadow story, a trauma story, a disowned self story. There's so much more to me than that. So the 3-2-1-0 process is probably some of the highest quality techniques, technical materials I found. It's extremely helpful for in a very theatrical, whole body, honoring of drama, honoring of wisdom, honoring of the history of psychotherapy and education of the mind-body experience. It's probably one of the most thorough ways that I have found to engage shadow work, okay? Or I should say engage shadow material. So that's one of our main go-to practices that everybody gets, and for a steward, they go through that shit with me over and over and over and over and over again. So I support them doing that. Now, 3-2-1-0 process is a handful. If you are a beginner to this work, it is a handful. This is why we suggest, I'll touch upon it again, this is why we suggest get a team, get some people who know how to walk you through that. Contact me, contact the stewards through embodyingitb.org, and our responsibility is to walk you through that process, not telling you what that shadow material means, but coaching you through the process of how to engage it, how to relate to keeping you on track on how to relate to it, how to engage it, and how to listen to it, and how to participate. Not what to do about it, but how to do that stuff, okay? You must make your own discoveries. You must be able to navigate your own territory, or else it's a codependent relationship. But we just basically coach you through the process and give you some education on what science says and what the practical experience has to say. So, the second component, the other material that we do, the other practice that we do is the voice dialoguing and voice and shadow. So in the voice dialogue community, they don't actually use the term shadow too much. They do use the term disowned a lot because in the story of voice dialogue, there are kind of 3 different ways of talking about voices. There's primary voices, there's hidden voices, and then there's opposing voices. So primary voices, hidden voices, and opposing voices. You might be saying to yourself, well, what the heck is a voice? How do we define a voice? All right, well, a voice is essentially in the evolution of a human being from 0 to about, let's say, 20 years old, and other ones can come online later on, but usually the primary and the most stable ones come online relatively early, and they are roles. Essentially, they are personification of roles. One easy way to talk about them is one of the oldest ones. 2 of the oldest ones are controller and protector. So, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, think about if you've ever raised children, one of the primary things the child has to do in the beginning of life is learn how to control its spastic kind of impulsive system. So they have to learn how to use arms and legs, lift their head, walk, move, become autonomous in a physical way. And then they also have to learn how to control other things. They have to control their bowels. They have to control their interest in grabbing things and putting it in their mouth. If you spend time around children, they just seem to want to jam the whole world in their mouth because the sensory information is so high here. So human beings and young human beings have to learn and have to be kind of educated in how to create self-control, and then learn mental autonomy on top of physical autonomy, or I should say psychological autonomy on top of physical autonomy as they learn how to become adults. And that's very much the journey of most human beings. And the primary role or voice that usually comes on with that is what we call the controller. The controller and these other primary voices, these other really, really basic voices, they are kind of like a conglomeration of a few things. First and foremost, guardians, who's teaching the child how to control themselves and how to manage their impulse responses, how to navigate territory internally and externally. The voice is very much going to be shaped by that. Okay, so whoever was in your world, whoever was your primary guardian and primary teacher, in your home, as far as your person guarding you is concerned and raising you, it's going to be a fair dose of that. The language they used, how they talked to you, how they related to you, your controller is going to be influenced by that. There is a suggestion that there is an inherent need for controller, that part of, and there's no data for this whatsoever. This is just like a speculation theory from people who have done a lot of voice dialoguing work. And a lot means they've dedicated 30 years, the founders, 30, 40 years to studying voice dialoguing and doing voice dialoguing with thousands of people around the world. And so this is from their practical experience. Hal and Sidgerstone and their other followers and not followers, but students and dedicated faculty they seem to suggest that there's like this inherent component of the brain that will naturally start to open up and want to control, want to manage, want to manipulate and work reality. Though we cannot, though we haven't, there hasn't been any research that's put into this to prove this. Other developmental psychologists do suggest there's a natural kind of momentum in human beings to learn how to relate and manage and use environmental materials. And so for the, what's it called, for the voice dialoguing community, they're like, yeah, sure, the controller is an inherent voice. A lot of the voices, especially controller and protector, those are inherent voices to a human consciousness, because the human consciousness will, as it ages, start to use tools just like every other freaking creature on this planet. So there's a belief that the controller is both inherent, is an inherent voice that kind of comes online and kind of navigates its own self. It's informed by whoever was my guardians. It's also informed by my observations, how successful I am, and informed by that. And so the controller is one of the primary voices, and primary voices are voices that are for the uninformed or uneducated, the primary voices are kind of what we call our personality. So if someone was to sit down and say, hey, listen, tell me about yourself, what kind of qualities do you have? And you just started rattling off information that you think about yourself, things that you come to learn about yourself, and you know, preferences about you, what you're excited about, what you're not excited about, deep momentums and interests for you. What we have found with voice dialoguing is that those aren't actually who you are. Those are actually voices that are dominating your life experience. And that there's a high probability the more we do voice work and the more we start to relate to voice work, relate to voices and hear more from those voices, the more we start to see, holy shit, those are actually roles. Those are personifications of roles and behavior all wrapped into one. So one way, since we've already talked about the 3-2-1-0 process, one way to think about voices is it's ton of second person perspective voice work. Okay. So, in fact, Ken Wilber's 3-2-1-0 process that he created was seriously influenced by the Hal and Sidra Stone voice dialoguing, because guess what? Ken was trained in a lot of stuff having to do with voice dialoguing from Hal and Sidra Stone. So, anywho, so doing this voice work is like doing a bunch of second person perspective type work. Okay, so what we do is we can once again do this activity of, you know, talking to the controller, talking to this oldest portion of ourselves and talking to the controller and having a conversation with them. And once again, in the voice dialoguing community, we suggest the same thing. We suggest kind of scooching over and kind of having a conversation with that voice, and then embodying that voice. So pretending, so it's going from second person to first person over and over and over and over and over again. So one of the first things that we have that we'll usually do in the voice work is in ITB, we usually start with the 3-2-1-0 process because it kind of creates a little bit more form and stability. But then once we get kind of used to it, we just kind of bounce back and forth between 2 and 1. And we do a lot of conversation with the second person perspective, and then talk a fair bit about what is it like for me to talk as that person, you know, pretend in the traditional cue in voice dialogue is we'll say something like, all right, we're going to talk to the controller, or the part of you that wants to control, you know, the body, the self, and the life of this person we call Jeff. So I would like to talk to the person that's controlling Jeff's life. So please switch body position. So what we do is we basically get up and move around and and we'd start to feel, how would it feel to be the controller of Jeff's life? And so as I do that, we would say, all right, move your chair, move your whole posture and sitting into a position of the person that's controlling Jeff's life. So if I personally do that right now, what does that feel like? All right, so if I move my chair over here, what does that really feel like? So my controller goes into this position right here, kind of hunched forwards, one hand on my thigh, the other elbow on my thigh, really leaning forward, ready to get to know what's going on and highly informed. So as I move into this position, I start to feel this really strong, oh yeah, I'm in control. I got this. If anything's going to go on, I'm going to be telling the story about what this is. I'm the one that's informing about what's going to about to happen next. And so as I move and shift into this position and start to really feel as if I am the controller of Jeff's life, and the controller of the resources in Jeff's life, there's almost like a different bodily sensation that will come up for me. And most of the time, what we also notice is as we talk to these primary voices, you'll also start to hear a different form of language, a different way of talking, a different way of relating will start to surface. So I'm going to go back to normal, what we call, aware self, what voice dialoguing community calls the aware self. And what I'm gonna get back into not just that controller entity, but actually sitting as just this aware self that is Jeff, that has this Jeff identity and Jeff body. So this may sound, once again, this may sound a little bit schizophrenic. This may be like, holy shit, is this gonna make me a crazy person? No, it's not. You may look like a crazy person to some people if you're doing this shit in public, but you're not gonna turn into a crazy person. Don't worry about that. All right. So we talked about primary voices. So primary voices are roles that basically rule your life. And there can be, one of the oldest ones we talked about is controller and protector. Also, one of the ways to kind of find signature ones to you, instead of just taking the general category of protector and controller, you could say something like, let me talk to the person that is making a lot of the choices for my life. Okay. And then we'd ask you once again, move your chair and kind of take the position of the choice maker, you might want to call them. We oftentimes want to give them a title about what they do. Okay. You can also play the game of, I would like to talk to my creative self. I would like to talk to my sensual self. I would like to talk to my angry self. I would like to talk to my afraid self. So you could start talking to a lot of these other characters and kind of just name them as far as like an emotion or a mode of being. And you can start to get some really wonderful material with this. And this will start to show you ones that you can really, really relate to. If you start doing these kind of general terms and emotional names, what you may notice is that certain ones feel really normal to you. So you may feel, if you're a creative person and you ask for the creative self or the creative voice to come through and to talk about them, when you shift and move in that position, you may feel very at home there, okay? And that's how we can oftentimes identify a primary voice. Now it gets really, really hairy when you maybe name one of these emotions like angry self, scared self, sad self, numb self, joyous self. What you may notice is that you may be living your life from an angry voice, from an angry self, or a fearful voice, or a fearful self. You may notice that that self starts to kick in at different times. So those are oftentimes, that's one way of seeing kind of like primary voices. This will also start to unveil what we call hidden voices. Hidden voices are voices that are active, but we didn't know they kind of had this kind of quality. We didn't know they had a certain quality to them. So if you were to play the game of self-investigation, of self-inquiry, and you just started picking, some basic emotional states of angry, afraid, sad, happy, joyful, contentedness, if you just take those 6 kind of voices and listen to each one of them, you may notice some of those are easy to move into and feel normal. Other ones may be very hard for you to relate to. A personal example of this is the fear voice for me. When growing up as a human being, I've always had this kind of large physical body, and I was very athletic and very skilled as far as moving it and using it and stuff like that. So immediately the world, basically anybody I ever ran into thought, of course, I was going to be a big sporty guy and into all these different things. And there seemed to be this storyline that since I have this bigger body, I'm not afraid. I shouldn't be afraid. Why would I be afraid having this big old masculine, thick, traditionally masculine body, so sporty and so physical and stuff like that? How on earth could he be afraid, right? How on earth could fear be in his life? And so that was oftentimes a story that I felt being projected onto me. And it was also a story as a young man, a story, as I looked at superheroes and ninjas and samurais and Jedis, the story was that in order to be those things, there couldn't be any fear. So speaking of shadow, fear for me got pushed out of my system. Me giving permission to myself to be afraid, to feel fear and work through fear, I pushed that shit right out of my life, because as my training is in my early life, by my own choices and by the things that I watched on television and other media and other art, it told me the story that I should not feel that thing. Very, very, very poor advice, okay? So for me, as I started doing a lot of shadow work around fear and voice work around fear, my primary emotional experience when I first started making contact with that voice of fear was numbness. I just didn't feel anything. But not feeling anything is still an emotional sensation and a feeling. So that actually took a while to kind of take that numbness and sit with it long enough to start to thaw, for me to really start to feel and experience my fear voice, my fear self. So we want to keep in mind that, and of course that turned into a beautiful fucking journey of terror and horror and realization and deep, deep gratitude of being alive and having my own life and understanding my own worth as a human being. That being aside, the point is that as we start to play some of these other voices, we start to notice that some of them may be very hidden. Some of them may be very kind of distant for us. Okay. So hidden voices, and then the next voice we're going to talk about the next category of opposing voices. If the voice dialogue community was going to be forced to talk about shadow, this is kind of how they talk about shadow: is hidden voices and opposing voices, or aggravated, not aggravated, what's the term? Adversarial voices. So primary voices are clear, they're on your radar, you can see them. And then hidden voices and adversarial voices are much more intense, and they're oftentimes off your radar. Okay, so hidden voices are ones that we discover along the way. We're kind of like, oh, I didn't realize that was such an important voice. So for me, the fear one, I didn't realize that it was hidden. And then I didn't realize that because I hid it, it started to rule my life. It started to be very problematic for me. The reality was I was in deep fear, but I was numb to it, and so I couldn't relate to it and do something with it. So once again, you never get rid of anything that's inside of you. You never get rid of any type of experience that happens. That's just what's the priority at the time. How central is it to your identity? And anything that you've strongly hidden or strongly disowned is going to be central to your identity. You just don't fucking know it. And that's the problem with shadow. So I'm going to say that again, because that's a really big deal. Anything that you work really hard to disown or hide from yourself, because you're working so hard to do it, immediately centralizes to your world. It immediately becomes the center of how you do life, because you work so hard to conceal it. So that sounds contradictory, but it's very, very, very real. So the harder you work to conceal something, the more it becomes a central component of your identity. And so if you build an identity off of a lived, 5, 10, 15, 20 years of repressing your fear, you're going to build a life having to do with repressing fear all the time. And that's going to influence everything in your relationship, everything in your existence. So the more we repress things, the more we try and disown things, the more they become central to our existence and central to how we've built our life. Okay. Big, big, big important information there. So we have hidden voices, which are oftentimes, it's more about discovering. It's kind of like, holy shit, that's kind of cool, or wow, I didn't realize that, and yada, yada, yada. And then we have adversarial or oppositional voices. Adversarial and oppositional voices are voices that in the storytelling world are probably best represented as the tricksters or the jokers or the thieves or the monsters, okay? So any kind of character you see in a movie or an ancient story, any type of, hero's journey type of thing, kind of like you have your main character who is the good, quote unquote, the good person, and then the monster that has to be defeated or overcome or stolen from, or whatever the hell the line is. Those are the opposing voices. Okay, those are the adversarial voices. Now, the exciting thing is that all your opposing voices, all your adversarial voices, that shit's you too. All right. So these are all your voices. These are all components of self. So one way of kind of finding opposing voices is listening to dreams. Dreams are a wonderful source of opposing voices, of finding oppositional or adversarial voices. So when we listen to our dreams or look for the monsters in our dreams, those monsters usually represent like I said, oppositional or adversarial voices. And so what we suggest in ITB is doing kind of like a visualization activity, which is imagine that monster from your dream in your waking life. Imagine it sitting in the room with you and having a conversation with it. So we do the second person perspective game again. Okay. So we sit that monster character in your room. No matter how horrifying it is, you bring yourself into a relationship with you. And remember, this is imagination, so it can't really do anything to you. You may feel scared, you may feel terrified, you may feel all kinds of things, but that's just you doing that to you. Okay. It's not something that, remember, every monster in your dream, every oppositional voice or adversarial voice in your dreams or in your internal world, that is you trying to send a message to yourself. So this is some of the gold that we start to run into, is that the more we make room in our world for not only our primary voices, but our hidden voices and then our oppositional adversarial voices, the more we make room for them kind of at the table of conversation, the more we start to learn. And I will tell you, like 9 times out of 10, when people start doing this work with adversarial or oppositional voices, when you start to have conversations with the monsters, what we notice is that the monsters aren't monsters. They're disowned material, they're shadow material, they're trauma material that are trying to get your attention so they can integrate. I'm gonna say that again because this is of great, great, great value. Every monster that comes to you, every adversarial voice that shows itself, is a part of you that's trying to relay data to you about existence, about what's real for their perspective and their experience, whether it comes from trauma or whether it comes from just a component of your humanity that you've disowned. It's all trying to relay information and come home to the heart and to be welcome at the table. Now, this may sound very contradictory. This may sound very scary. It usually is for a lot of people. It seems very counterproductive to let the devil to your table. It sounds very counterproductive to let the monsters come to your table and eat. It seems very counterproductive to allow for yourself to make relationship to the major bad characters in your interior existence. It may feel very wrong. And the thing we want to say about that is it doesn't mean you need to be possessed by them. It doesn't mean you need to act like them. It doesn't mean that you should have no boundaries with them. Just simply means that it is okay to include them in the dynamism that is your human experience, because every one of us has a trickster inside of us. Every one of us has a very malevolent voice inside of us that knows how to do horrible things. Every one of us has a voice inside of us that just wants to burn the world down and destroy our lives. It doesn't mean you need to let them run your world. What it does mean is you better keep your eye on them, because if you don't watch them, if you don't include them in your conversation, they're going to sneak their way into your world when you're tired, when you're hungry or dehydrated, when you haven't got enough exercise, and when you're not minding the store, tending your garden, okay? Put in high stress situations. And God knows there's plenty of stress to go around these days, okay? So anything that you do not welcome to the table and allow at the table and keep healthy boundaries with will usually come and have you. It'll come and get you, okay? And so one of the things, one of my favorite quotes from Wilber, from Ken Wilber, who created the 3210, who created the 321 process, was, he said, if you don't own your shadow, it's going to own you. And so if you don't care for your problems, and if you don't look for your blind side or your blind spots are going to screw your life over. They're going to show up and they're going to be the ones that trip you up and destroy you. So this is the story of the shadow, okay? So we want to, once again, think of the primary voices, the hidden voices, and the adversarial voices. I want to say one thing about these adversarial voices. Remember that I'm not saying when these adversarial voices come home, especially that you should fuse with them, okay? Especially the voice in your life that wants to destroy your life. Every one of us, for some reason, or it's actually, there's a very good reason for it. But there is a voice inside of us that wants to kind of destroy ourselves and destroy our lives and destroy the world around us. There's this kind of a voice in us that wants to see everything just be kind of mowed down, burned down, kind of brought back into the earth. And it's a very kind of, what one could say, very untamed, very wild, very impulsive self, okay? It seems to be a component of our identity that's very, very, very associated with our survival instincts from a very basic fight or flight stage of development. So it's the part of self that doesn't really care about the mind, the psyche, the body. Its only interest is to express its impulsivity. And the positive side of this voice is that it can get you out of a whole lot. It's exceedingly intuitive. And if cultivated, if the relationship is cultivated very nicely, it can provide a very, very primal survival fluidness when you are in high risk situations, and when I say high risk, I mean life-threatening situations. So it's kind of a voice that takes over in us, takes over control in us when we are in very, very high stress, life-threatening types of situations. People who have ever done soldiering and seen combat and gone into combat situations, or at least even been at the edges of combat situations, can very much feel this voice. So a lot of veterans that I've worked with, this voice is one they have to tend with on a regular basis, because this voice is, it's constantly interested in survival. It's constantly interested in, I don't give a shit about the body. I don't care about the pain. I don't care about the mind. It doesn't matter. I actually don't give a shit about a lot of this stuff. It's just, I want to be able to survive and get through and get out and get free and do whatever I want, do whatever I can. And so it oftentimes shows up in situations where, for people who've experienced a whole lot of really intense, life-threatening situations. And like I said, there's a lot of power there. There's a lot of fluidness there. There's a lot of intuitive nature there, and it can feel very powerful. It can feel very good. It can feel very wild and alive. And you kind of have to watch if you do make contact with this character, with this voice, you have to kind of be careful and remember that it's definitely not a voice to make a life out of. All right. And it's definitely not a voice that needs to be in control of your life. Okay. So speaking of that topic, all voices are welcome at the table. Okay. So this is kind of using the analogy of what I like to call a round table or a CEO table. So inevitably, the more voice work you do, the more you find out, wow, there's a whole lot of damn voices inside of me. There's a whole lot of perspectives. There's a whole lot of characters that are here that are trying to communicate. And so an obvious question that evolves is, well, who am I? What the hell who's in here? Who's doing this? Whose life actually is this? If I can identify all these different voices inside of me that all have different momentums and have had different levels of control over my life, who's actually running the show here? And this is where in voice dialoguing, they talk about something called the aware self. And both of those letters or both of the first letters in both those words are capitalized. So it's capital A, aware, meaning like a strong level of awareness, and capital S, self, meaning the self, not just a self or a voice, but the self, the voice. So you have the aware self is your true nature. And that's just another way to kind of touch on what we touched on earlier with the zero portion of the 3210 process is the canvas. So to translate here a little bit, to do a translation from 3210 process to voice dialogue, the zero, the condition that our true nature is of being the canvas, the equivalent to that is the aware self in voice dialogue. And so the aware self is the place in which we make these decisions from. It is an aware self is one that often operates without a whole lot of self-identification. It's just kind of like this awareness, this presence that's listening to these voices and then making a choice based off of whatever these voices say. It's similar to having a consultant agency where you have your consultants at a nice big round table, and all your consultants give information, all these little voices give information, and then you choose based off of their information, you choose, which consultants to pay attention to. If you're in the midst of caring for your child and you have to change a diaper, it's not time to enlist the toughest, gruffest, I don't give a shit kind of voice when you're caring for your child and changing their diaper. That may not be nurturing. That may not be the nurturing for the child that the child needs. And so it's one of those deals where we do want to keep in mind that that's kind of the practice that we're going to suggest. So the more we kind of get a handle on becoming aware of these different voices and making a space for these different voices, the more we kind of get an idea of who the aware self is, and the more we use this kind of model of the consultants, the more we're able to then proceed with the aware self making this decision. So we could use a round table idea, we could use a consultant's table idea. Other people talk about the analogy of a boat or a spaceship, and those things have captains. So if you're and you want to make sure the captain's making the decisions for the ship or for the boat or for the ship. You don't want the fear voice to make decisions about the ship. You don't want the greedy voice to make decisions about the ship. You don't want just the creative self or creative voice making decisions as captain of the ship. You want to make sure that all the voices can report to the ship's captain, but then also not be held to the standard of having to captain the ship if they're not the captain. Okay. So these are some of the practices that we suggest for this. This is some of the ideas and some of the ways that we suggest moving forwards with this. So our two primary practices are the 3-2-1-0 process and then the voice dialogue process. So once again, I'm going to reiterate, if you take up these practices, find a team, build a team. Okay. You can do it on your own, but I will tell you from my own personal experience of going it alone for certain periods of time, going alone is helpful. It is doable, but it leaves out a lot of opportunity to discover more. Once again, shadow is stuff that we have disowned. So some stuff is easy to find on our own. Other stuff is very difficult to find. Okay. Other stuff may be very well hidden for us when we go looking. Whereas if we're sitting with another human being, a partner or multiple human beings on this topic, they're going to see a lot more stuff than we can see about ourselves. So they oftentimes will kind of see, something seems off here. There seems like something we could investigate here. So it's helpful, especially with a trained human being. So your other teammates could be other coaches that may be versed in this stuff. Of course, ITB stewards, counselors, psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, clergy persons, if your clergy persons are capable and skilled in these ways, have some kind of background in this information. So having a team can be darn helpful. Do not bring this to your friends. I would not suggest burdening your friends with this stuff, because friends can be shitty at doing therapy, can be shitty at just listening and holding the bucket sometimes. And some of your friends may, kind of not be awesome people they may not, even though they're your friends and you're friendly with them, they might not be trustworthy enough to carry this kind of burden with you. Okay. So we definitely want to make sure we have a group we definitely want to choose our teammates carefully. I also suggest you guys, educate yourself on the psyche. And the best way to do that is through integral theory. Once again, with us ITB stewards, we train in integral theory. So we can share that with you, or you can just hop online and look up Ken Wilber, or you can go to integrallife.com and learn about integral theory. And there's plenty of books out there about integral theory. So definitely learn about your psyche, learn about the integral map. And then as far as practice is concerned, because this is a common question, as far as practice is concerned, please, please, please practice weekly if you can. Once a week, twice a week for at least a half an hour each time you sit down is extremely helpful, and make sure you have that logbook. So that's kind of that as far as how to go forwards with that stuff. So per usual, thank you all very much for coming and joining. Thanks for participating. Hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, my name is Jeff Koshin West. I'm I'm the founder of Integral Transformative Bodywork. This has been another Sunday school, and we do Sunday schools every Sunday. We do accept donations. You can look for Integral Transformative Bodywork on PayPal, and you can contribute to us as far as that's concerned. If you feel like it's not an expectation, it's just an option. It does support ITB keeping its lights on and functioning and producing. Also, if you want to learn more about our activities, go to embodyingitb.org. You'll see that's our website. You'll see all kinds of stuff that we do there, all kinds of things that we offer. And also, I know this is going on YouTube, but also keep in mind going forwards that the ITB stewards, myself and a couple of the other stewards are offering online coaching, and we're doing online coaching via Zoom. And we're doing, because we're in a pandemic right now and a lot of people's needs, especially monetary needs, are compromised, we're doing kind of a sliding scale. So a normal session, an hour of coaching would be $85 an hour, but we're creating a sliding scale. So anywhere between 25 to 85. And so you can have these sessions. We want to make sure people have access to this from all around the world, all different kind of pay situations. We want to make sure there's an exchange of money for the expertise, but we're shooting for anywhere between a base rate of 25 to 85 and see what works for you as far as that's concerned. All that scheduling can be done online at embodyingitb.org. Go to our coaching page and you'll find all the information you need. I want to say thank you very much for joining us. I am deeply grateful for you participating. I hope this has been helpful to you, and please reach out and comment and like our YouTube page so you'll hear more about us. If you want to be part of our emailing list, just go to just send an email to embodyingitb@gmail.com and let us know you want to get on our mailing list, and we'll include you, and you'll be getting weekly as well as monthly newsletters, weekly information, and you'll get updates. What am I saying? You'll get updates. We'll just leave it at that. All right, deep gratitude. Thank you so much for participating. And we will see you next time.